Thank you, Tony. You're very kind. Appreciate that. I like your theme, living by faith. And I count it a privilege to be here to talk about one of the great heroes of the faith, faithful Joseph. Joseph is one of the greatest characters of all history. There are qualities about him that appeal to me greatly. His mellow heart, his tenderness, his tender heart. He's touched so easily and by things that matter. He's the Old Testament character most like Jesus Christ. More space is given in the Scriptures to the narrative of Joseph than any other person, with the exception maybe of his great-grandfather, Abraham. 14 chapters of Holy Writ are devoted to the story of Joseph. Genesis chapters 37 through 50 are all devoted to the story of Joseph. And his story is the story of victory over despair and hardship. Nothing is finer in all the annals of literature, sacred or profane, than this narrative of this simple, dignified personality, Joseph, who is so attractive in every way that we observe him, and who was tested beyond any limits that we can imagine. And yet he was triumphant in all. A preacher went to the hospital one time to visit a woman who immediately began crying. And she said, why do I have to suffer like this? I've always tried to be faithful. She reasoned wrongly that something was wrong with her or her life or with God. She reasoned that if a person always strives to serve God and be sincere and faithful, everything's going to turn out right. There'll be no problems of any great magnitude to deal with. But she was wrong, and if we reason like that, then we're in for some disturbing experiences, because this life in which we live is strewn with problems, with suffering, with heartache, with disappointment, with tragedies and hardships of all kinds. And Joseph is a model of one who was faced with some of life's hardest trials, and yet he was so faithful and so victorious in handling those trials and those hardships that he deserves to be a model for every one of us. He faced trials that would break the heart of most of us. Nobody has ever faced more severe trials than Joseph. Here he is, a young man, grew up in a home where he was the darling of his father. He was being groomed for a position of leadership and responsibility in the family. He must have felt quite secure in that family of his father, Jacob. But instead of receiving love from his brothers, he was envied and hated with murderous intent and sold into bondage. Down in Egypt, he faced trial after trial. It seemed at first that things were going well. He was highly favored by his master, Potiphar, and he seemed to be well established in that household. And then Potiphar's immoral wife began to try to seduce him, to tempt him to impurity sexually. And when he refused and declined to have any part in that impurity and immorality, of course, she falsely accused him and slandered him. As a result, he was put in prison. He could have been put to death, but he was instead put in prison, and there he could have grown cynical and lapsed into despair. But he didn't. He behaved himself in such a way that he commanded the respect of all that was around him. Wasn't long till he had gained the confidence of his masters, and he was placed in a position of responsibility there in the jail. Lovelace, I believe, worded these beautiful words: "Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage." He was not confined in a cage in prison, even in Egypt. He was a man of such integrity and such honor in response to these trials of life that he soon became a master over the situation and gained the confidence of those about him. Later on, he was forgotten by one who could have been a benefactor of his. You remember the part of the story that involves the butler and the baker, and he was forgotten by the baker who could have been a great benefactor of his and helped him a lot. But he was forgotten, and he might have lashed out and said, "Do you blame me for being cynical?" No person ever had more just human grounds for being bitter and cynical and lapsing into utter despair than Joseph here, as a lonely Hebrew boy, a long distance from home and in captivity. But instead of lashing out, instead of disrespecting God and lashing out in hostility, he remained in command of his spirit and behaved so admirably here. Later on, when his brothers came down into the land of Egypt to buy food, he behaved in such a remarkable way. As a matter of fact, he behaved in not only a remarkable way, but a way that we would not have expected. He acted out of the ordinary. Instead of retaliating, reacting in resentment, he was able to forgive those people that had hated him so deeply and had treated him so crudely. So the absence of despair, the absence of despondency and hate in Joseph is remarkable. How was he able to react in such a way? If we could learn his secret, then our lives would be happier, they would be more beautiful, the world around us would be better. If we could just latch on to Joseph's secret. What is his secret for being able to react and respond to hardship and trouble as he did? Wayne Oates says there are three possible alternatives to treatment of this kind and to the trials of life. He said we can either break down or break out, or we can break through. Break down, break out, break through. Joseph broke through. What's his secret for breaking through? Great faith. Great faith. Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is the substance of things hoped for. Substance gives foundation to something. It's closely related to our hopes. Here are two relative terms, faith and hope. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. And it gives reality to things that we do not see. It's the evidence of things not seen. The Bible describes the kind of faith that Joseph had as that kind of faith that gains the victory over the world. 1 John 5:4. This is the victory that overcomes the world, even our faith. Here is a type of faith that can withstand the storms and the hardships and the struggles of life. Lead an individual to victory. Joseph was a man of great faith. In Hebrews 11:22, it said that by faith, Joseph, when his end was nigh, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel from Egypt and gave commandment concerning his bones. There's a sermon in the lesson about the bones of Joseph. Joseph died 64 years before the birth of Moses. And yet, when Moses is 80 years old, 60 plus 80, 64 plus 80 gives us a total of 144 years. There was another man who acted by faith. He remembered the solemn oath that Joseph had taken of the children of Israel, that those bones of his not be left in the land of Egypt. Here is a man who, of such faith that he wanted to be a continuing part of God's mission for the children of Israel. He believed he knew something of the history of the Jews and believed that one day the Hebrews would leave the land of Egypt. And he desired, even though that would be long after his death, to be a continuing part of the history of the Hebrew people. And we read in Genesis chapter 50 and verses 25 and 26, where Joseph, at the time of his death, took a vow of the children of Israel and made mention of that God would visit them and they would depart from the land of Canaan, and said, when you do, you carry my bones with you. Here was another man of like faith, Moses, who, according to Exodus 13 and verse 19, before they left the land of Egypt, gathered together those bones of Joseph and carried them 40 years through the wilderness. That adds another 40 years to 144, and then students believe that it was 17 years after the Hebrews entered the land of Canaan before those bones were buried in old Mount Ephraim in Shechem. Make it a total of 201 years from the time this man that time he died and embalmed and put in a coffin in Egypt, and the time those bones were ultimately buried in the land that was promised to the children of Abraham. 201 years elapsed there. What a sermon in faith here in these bones. Joseph was a man of active, genuine, heroic faith from beginning to end. He had that kind of faith like his great-grandmother Sarah had, who enabled her to give birth to a son, to one that was same as dead, and who in turn became the father of a multitude of people. He had that kind of faith that his great-grandfather Abraham had, who looked for the city which hath the foundations, whose builder and maker is God. That kind of faith that resided in Noah, that faith that moved him to respond to the command of God, prepare an ark through which he condemned the world and saved his own house and became heir of the righteousness, which is according to faith. That's the secret of the faithful Joseph. That faith, that man who by faith walked daily in the counsel of God Almighty. That faith enabled Joseph to meet and to face the trials and the difficulties of his life. His first temptation was with the slavery, the bondage that he had to face after being sold by his brothers. And can you imagine the associating despair, the heartache that was connected with that? Can you imagine the aloneness down there in the land of Egypt, far removed from his family, separated from those, his father and those that did love him, and yet he was able to overcome that despair and that despondency by his great faith. Here was a man being prepared for a great responsibility in his father's family. There's every indication that the father was grooming him to be the leader of the family after he had passed on. And he was groomed for that great position. And now here he is on the lowest rung of the social ladder, in slavery. That type of degradation and shame that fills the hearts of people with resentment and with hatred. And yet, he didn't yield to self-pity. He was able to overcome self-pity and despair and display a remarkable spirit about all of the circumstances around him. That's remarkable. How did he do that? He was able to face that by faith, that kind of overcoming faith, that faith that overcame the partiality of his father and the hatred of his brother and the aloneness and the separation down in Egypt, that faith that would enable him to triumph over poverty and the other problems that arose in his life. Then down in the land of Egypt, his next trial, after being settled down to the land of Egypt as a slave, was that the wife, the immoral wife of his master, Potiphar, tried to seduce him to adultery. Day after day she hammered on him. It was constant. Verse 10 of chapter 39 says that day by day she fastened her eyes upon him and urged him to commit adultery with her. And he refused, absolutely refused. And why? If nobody gets hurt, it might have been to his advantage in many ways to have yielded to her solicitations. But he didn't. He refused. He determined to maintain his purity and refused to be made impure or contaminated by her immoral character. You know how Joseph overcame? He resisted because he was determined to resist. He had something in his heart that gave him a purpose and a will to overcome. Like Daniel, he purposed in his heart that he would not corrupt himself with the king's dainties. Like Moses, who looked unto the recompense of the reward. Can you imagine the consequences, even to subsequent generations and even us today? Had Moses have not Moses, but Joseph had failed in maintaining the purity of the faith that is so essential to the purposes of God? He overcame because he was determined to overcome. Resist the devil, James 4:7 says, and he'll flee from you. And in verse 9 of Genesis 39, Joseph states three other reasons associated with his faith here that enabled him to overcome that trial and that solicitation of this impure, immoral woman. He said, first of all, I remember that my master trusts me, and he was a man of such integrity that he refuse to betray the trust of that master. My master has placed me over this household here. He doesn't know what's here, but he's put me totally in charge. And Joseph respected the trust that his master had placed in him. And then secondly, he said, there's just one thing in all of this household that he hasn't placed under me and my control, and that's you. He was talking to Potiphar's wife, and that's you, and there's a reason for that, he says. That's because you are something special to him. You are his wife. You belong to him, inclusively and exclusively. And I will not violate that sacred environment. And then in verse 9, he said, how could I commit this great sin against my God? What a man of integrity. And what gave him the power, the strength to face a trial like that victoriously and triumphantly? His faith. By faith in Almighty God. That faith which gives a person the incentive to rise above sin and not lapse into it, helped him overcome this great trial there in the land of Egypt. And then wasn't long until Joseph faced an entirely different kind of trial down there in the land of Egypt. Instead of poverty, he's quite suddenly in a position of high honor and prosperity. He's elevated to that of the ruler of the land of Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh. How does he respond to this? Instead of being in slavery, he's now free. Why doesn't he escape? I've often wondered why Joseph didn't run away and go back home. He'd longed to go back home. He had suffered so much because of the separation from his family over the years. He loved that father, and he loved his brother Benjamin. He loved other members of the family, and how he longed to be back in the land of Canaan. Now he's in position, a position of power, a position to do just about what he wants to do. Why doesn't he escape? Why doesn't he return home? Well, we don't know all the answers to that, but we know this, that in all of this experience, he kept a level head, maintained a wonderful spirit and attitude. This prosperity and power doesn't swell his head. You know, it takes a steadier hand to carry a full bucket than it does one half full. Sometimes prosperity is a more severe test and trial of us than poverty. But Joseph demonstrates that he can meet, he can face, he can overcome any kind of trial. But his most severe trial came when his brothers came down to the land of Egypt to buy food. When for the first time in 22 years, he looked into those eyes that the last time he saw were filled with envy and hatred. And what would have been the natural response? What would have been the ordinary human response? Retaliation. Some years ago, I ran down in Alabama, a man who had grown up in this county, Warren County. I'd known him here with a little bit of relationship, blood relationship between him and my family. I ran into him, and he made this statement to me. He said, I'm going back to Warren County one of these days, but I'm working now to get enough money to go into court and defeat the men who did me wrong up there. I want to see them brought to embarrassment I want to see that they're defeated, and I'm working now for enough money to do that. You see, that's the common response to mistreatment of this kind, resentment. But he faces these brothers who had did him such a great wrong, hated him so deeply and treated him so cruelly. He faces them with a forgiving attitude. With the eye of faith, this man was able to look beyond the present and not remember the envy and the hate. He's not trying to excuse their envy and hate and the things that they've done. They certainly need to make a correction of that. He's not trying to excuse that at all. But with the eye of faith, he looked beyond all the temporal things that had happened to him and saw that God had overruled for good. In verse 5 of chapter 45, when his brothers came down and he was first made known to them, they were, of course, outdone when they knew who Joseph was. But he was so tender-hearted, he said to them, fear not. I know you meant it for harm, but God meant it for good. God sent me on ahead of you to preserve you alive. In verse 20 of chapter 50, he says the same. When the father dies, these brothers are still ridden with the bad consciences. They said, now that daddy's gone, now that our father's gone, he'll really even the score. But he didn't. He said, don't be afraid. I know that you meant it for harm, but God meant it for good. Isn't that a wonderful attitude? And not only that, the magnificent thing about Joseph's reaction is that somehow he was able to lead them to repentance. God used him to make better men out of those brothers that needed to make so much improvement in their lives. Step by step, little by little, in the 14 chapters of the book of Genesis given to the personal narrative of Joseph, he was able to lead these brothers step by step back to that pit in Dothan. He first said, you're spies. You've come down here to spy out the land. And that was a ploy. He knew they weren't spies. He knew who they were. He said, I want you to go back home down and bring your youngest brother down here and prove that you're telling a straight story. And, of course, that's the very thing they didn't want to happen. They couldn't imagine their father agreeing to let Benjamin come down to the land of Egypt. And, of course, that was a great test for them. He kept Simeon for surety. He taunted them by returning their money and their bags of grain. And he caused them to sit down and contemplate, what's God doing to us here? And verse 21 of chapter 42 is a verse that I have difficulty reading without weeping. In the midst of all of these reminders of the rugged road of 22 years between now and the pit in Dothan, they said, while Joseph is back in his room weeping, trying to gain enough strength perhaps to come out and face them with the right spirit, they reasoned among themselves, we are very guilty concerning our brother. Because we heard his distress when he besought us. Can you imagine all that's implied in that? Can you look back 22 years in the history of Joseph And imagine what must have been the pleas of that little 17-year-old boy begging for their mercy there around that pit when he knew that bad things were in store for him. He besought us, and now this distress is come upon us. Can you imagine the magnificence of the personality, the magnificence of the inner fortitude and faith that enabled this man to gain a victory over circumstances like that? For the first time after 22 years, he found out that lie that these men had concocted and told to their father about his disappearance. You see, he had wondered, what did they tell Daddy? How did they explain my disappearance to him? Now he finds out. And how would you have reacted to a circumstance like that? We commend the greatness of this man's faith and his character that enabled him to overcome like this. You know, the normal reaction is resentment. I had a sweet little girl in school several years ago down in Alabama at the old Athens Bible School. She lost her mother. She became the cook and the housekeeper at home, and we were so hopeful that everything turned out with her. She married a good man, and they got along well for a while. Then she took lupus, terrible disease. And bless her heart, she didn't handle that real well. She grew bitter, resentful. She told me one day, said, I have a husband and children to look after. Why did this happen to me? And she was bitter about it. You see, that's the normal way to react to things of this kind. In marriage, if things don't turn out just exactly right, the tendency is to resent the partner. Sometimes in the church, we have reactions that cause us great heartache and trouble because people don't react as they should, react as Joseph did in matters of this kind. And then there's the attitude of resignation and fatalism. We hear people reason, well, God willed it, I just have to accept it. This is educational for me. People get what they deserve. We hear all sorts of explanations for things of this kind. But this is not the whole story. I don't know the answer, the total answer to all of these trials and tribulations that we have in this life. I think the Bible gives us a basic reason for those, to approve us, that so when we've been approved, we can receive the crown of life. But I don't know the total answer, but I know this. The important thing is not why these things happen to us, as they did to Joseph, but how we respond to them. Are we able to accept a world that has let us down because it's not perfect? Are we able to face a world and maintain our faith in a world when there's so much struggle and mistreatment and abuse and suffering and hardship and disappointment, earthquakes and volcanoes, airplanes falling? Are we able to accept a world like that and face it with this sublime faith that Joseph displays? Are we able to forgive people that disappoint us and let us down, and cause a better relationship to grow out of that. Joseph was a man of great faith, a faith that enabled him to overcome the father's partiality, which was unfair, to overcome the hatred of his brothers, to overcome his aloneness and his separation from the family, and to survive both poverty and prosperity. You know, such a faith is not only possible for us, but God wills it for us. Without faith, it's impossible to please him. He that cometh to God must believe that he is, that he's a rewarder of them that seek after him. And we can have it. It's available to us. Faith comes of hearing with the word of God. Romans 10:17. We can't have that faith if we're strangers to the word of God. So many lack it because they're so abysmally ignorant of God's truth, which produces faith and underpins faith of the kind that Joseph had. We must trust the promises of God and let him prove his trustworthiness. The life of Joseph proves that. The psalmist said in Psalm 27:13, I would have fainted unless I had believed to see the goodness of God in the land of the living. Wait for Jehovah. Be strong and let thy heart take courage. Yea, wait for Jehovah. Can you imagine how our lives today might have been so different if Joseph hadn't waited for the goodness of God, waited on to see the promises of God and the purposes of God fulfilled? This kind of faith that's displayed in Joseph can make us heirs of the righteousness which is according to faith. Thank you very much.